Well, to talk about the security of Canadians in regards to foreign interference, we're now joined by Pierre-Yves Bourduas, a former Deputy RCMP Commissioner, these days the President of PY Public Safety Management. Mr. Bourduas, good to see you again.
Always a pleasure, Michael.
Now, we got word today the committee that oversees national security has started to look into foreign interference in the election process. This, of course, follows the Prime Minister's directive to do so. I wonder, do you think this is the right mechanism to investigate the matter? Because if the big questions are what the Prime Minister knew and how he responded to it, this is not a parliamentary committee. This is, in fact, almost an executive committee.
Correct. But if you recall the comments by David Vigneault, the director of CSIS, in front of the parliamentary committee a couple of weeks ago, he clearly indicated that he'd much rather be able to pursue and continue the investigations as opposed to having an open discussion, a forum discussion, whereas some of the investigation and some of the investigative techniques that are used by the Canadian authorities in order to determine whether or not there's been political interference, then if it becomes public, it could potentially assist foreign government in better understanding how they can avoid detection in our country.
Mm-hmm. So some security concerns being raised, but I'm thinking about the many reports, most recently the one that came out yesterday that says there were reports prepared for the Prime Minister and the government about the issue, and this committee of parliamentarians reportedly told the PM back in 2019 that he had to do better to respond to foreign interference. So if those warnings, if those reports were not heeded, and we don't know that for a fact, but if they were not heeded, what makes us think that we can trust this time around that a review will actually be listened to?
Well, it's questions that elected official needs to manage amongst themselves. But as a public safety issue, I'd much rather see the Canadian authorities continuing to investigate and report, and the dissemination of this particular report would be up to the elected officials to determine who should have access, and if some part of the report needs to be made public, then it should be.
Mm-hmm. As you and I are speaking, as you know very well, the RCMP have begun their investigations into so-called Chinese police stations in the Greater Montreal area. Couple that with what we're now talking about in terms of election interference. What does that say to you about how far the federal government has to go to weed out foreign interference in this country?
The federal government needs to take this threat very seriously. If you'd recall, in 2013, Richard Fadden, who at the time was the director of CSIS, clearly indicated that CSIS was focused on foreign interference in of all areas, also our elected and elections process. So therefore, that was flagged in 2013. There were other reports that were tabled, and this is, in my opinion, and old stories that are getting more traction, which I welcome, but you also need to be fully cognizant of the fact that our authorities, either by the RCMP or CSIS, our Canadian authorities are certainly paying close attention to this particular interference because, for instance, the FBI in the United States have clearly looked at these types of, for instance, Chinese police station, and have so far, according to the director, Christopher Wray of the FBI, in 2020, the FBI arrested 16 mostly Chinese citizens operating in the United States on different charges as a result of their investigations in the United States. So it is a concern, not solely for Canadians, but also looking at what's happening, for instance, in the United States. These things are very disturbing to say the least.
Well, I wonder, as you say that then, and I take it what you're saying, that right now you do prefer these individual bodies like CSIS and the Committee of Parliamentarians to look into things that might be sensitive in terms of security. How do you allow that to happen then, but at the same time inspire greater confidence amongst Canadians? What can be done right now to essentially calm Canadians who are concerned about the level of foreign interference?
Well, there are a process, and there needs to be a certain level of transparencies for Canadians to be reassured about the electoral process within our country. But there are some areas that would need to be investigated with a little more diligence. And of course, this aspect of the investigation needs to remain secret up to a certain point, to allow the proper authorities to investigate these types of foreign interference in our electoral process.
Do you think there's anything that might be introduced in the interim that would help create that confidence right now?
Well, the confidence of Canadians is, of course, in my opinion, the strong basis for our electoral process. So we need to reassure, the government will need to reassure Canadians. But at the same time, the proper authorities will need to monitor these types of interference just to ensure that Canadians are reassured, but also Canadian needs to understand and be educated on the type of work that needs to be done, because these are long, protracted types of investigations, and with not an easy solution to actually satisfy the judicial process, if need be, to bring in front of our Canadian justice certain individual that might have interfered in our electoral process.
Pierre-Yves Bourduas, thank you for this. Really appreciate the insight.
My pleasure.